She ruled over a quarter of the Earth's surface. 400 million people lived under her authority. Her name defined an entire era, an age of industry, empire, and iron moral certainty. She sat atop the most powerful throne in the world, draped in silk and crowned in gold, and the world trembled at the sound of her name. And yet Queen Victoria spent much of her life in quiet, suffocating misery. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful woman who ever lived, a monarch whose empire stretched from the fog-soaked streets of London to the deserts of India, from the frozen edge of Canada to the heat-baked plains of Africa, felt at her core trapped, lonely, controlled, and for the final 40 years of her life, utterly, devastatingly broken. This is not the story you learned in history class. This is not a tale of imperial triumph or regal composure. This is the story of a woman who survived 6 assassination attempts before the age of 35, a woman who despised pregnancy and yet endured it 9 times, a woman who loved so fiercely that when that love was ripped away, she never fully returned to the world of the living. A woman who dressed her dead husband's clothes every single day for 4 decades, laid his shaving water out each morning as though he might return, and wore his cast-iron death mask to her grave. She was called the Grandmother of Europe because her blood ran through the veins of nearly every royal family on the continent, and yet that very blood carried a hidden curse, a genetic time bomb that would kill and cripple her descendants across generations. She was a contradiction, walking in black mourning silk, public strength, private collapse, imperial authority, personal imprisonment. A face that launched an era of moral certainty, hiding a mind that historians now believe may have been fractured by grief, depression, and the weight of expectations no human being should ever have to carry alone. By the end of this video, you will not see Queen Victoria the same way again, because the woman behind the crown was far stranger, far more tragic, and far more human than her legend allows. Stay with me. The full story is worth every second. Curiosity 1, a childhood designed to break her. She was born Alexandrina Victoria on the 24th of May, 1819, in Kensington Palace, a palace that, for all its grandeur, functioned more like a gilded cage. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, died when she was just 8 months old, before she could speak, before she could walk, before she even knew what fathers were. And from that moment forward, her mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy, constructed a system of control so absolute, so suffocating, that historians would later name it the Kensington System. And the word system does not begin to capture what it truly was. Curiosity 2. The Kensington System. Victoria was never permitted to be alone, not once. She was never allowed to walk down a staircase without someone holding her hand. She slept in her mother's bedroom every night until the day she became queen. She had no friends her own age, no companions, no playmates, no peers. Every letter she wrote was read by Conroy. Every visitor was screened. Every moment of her day was scheduled, monitored, and controlled. Conroy believed, or claimed to believe, that Victoria was emotionally and intellectually unfit to rule without guidance. His guidance. And he worked for years to maneuver himself into a position of regent power, intending to govern through her. He called her fragile. He called her unstable. He told her she would collapse under the pressure of the crown. She would spend the rest of her life proving him wrong. Curiosity 3. She only found out. She was heir to the throne at age 11. No one had told her, not directly, not clearly. She discovered the truth, that the crown of the British Empire would one day rest on her head, through a genealogy table tucked inside a history book, during a lesson. She reportedly looked at the list of successors, traced her finger down the page, and said quietly, "I am nearer to the throne than I thought." Her tutor confirmed it. Victoria is said to have looked up and replied with eerie composure, "I will be good." She was 11 years old. Curiosity 4. Her mother was her enemy. The relationship between Victoria and her mother is one of the most painful in royal history. Victoria despised John Conroy, despised him with a cold, clear fury that never softened. But her feelings about her mother were more complicated and perhaps more wounding. She had been told all her life that her mother loved her and protected her. It took years for Victoria to understand that her mother had allowed Conroy to effectively imprison her only child. When Victoria became queen, one of her first acts was to demand a bedroom of her own. Her first night sleeping alone, without her mother on the other side of the room, she was 18 years old. Curiosity 5. She became queen before breakfast. On the 20th of June, 1837, King William IV died in the early hours of the morning. A delegation arrived at Kensington Palace and was made to wait, because Victoria was still asleep. No one dared wake her. When she finally appeared, she met them alone. Not with her mother, not with Conroy, alone. She was 18 years and 1 month old. She was 5 feet tall. She was queen. Curiosity 6. Her first act was freedom. Her very first Privy Council meeting left hardened politicians speechless. They had been warned by her mother, by Conroy, by court whispers, that she was a nervous, fragile girl who might weep or falter in the face of real power. Instead, she entered the room composed, clear-eyed, and utterly in command. Lord Melbourne, who had become her first prime minister and something of a surrogate father, reportedly could not hide his admiration. She held herself with the gravity of someone who had been waiting for this moment their entire life. Because she had been. Curiosity 7. Melbourne became her emotional anchor and a political problem. Melbourne was charming, experienced, and avuncular in exactly the way Victoria needed. She adored him. She spent hours in his company, learning politics, yes, but also simply enjoying the first real male friendship of her life. Critics, then and now, noted how dependent she became on his counsel and his company. But Melbourne was a Whig, and when the Tories came to power, and Prime Minister Robert Peel attempted to appoint his own ladies-in-waiting to the palace, as was customary as a sign of political alignment, Victoria refused, flatly. She would not replace her Whig ladies with Tory ones. It became a constitutional crisis, known as the Bedchamber Crisis, and it nearly destabilized her early reign before it had properly begun. Even then, power was a double-edged sword. Curiosity 8. She proposed to Albert royal protocol at the time was clear. A queen regnant had to propose to her intended, not the other way around. And so, on the 15th of October, 1839, Victoria proposed to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her cousin, after knowing him as an adult for only 5 days. She described him in her diary with a kind of breathless reverence, his beauty, his eyes, his voice. She was instantly and completely in love. It was the most powerful and destabilizing emotion she had ever experienced, and it would shape every remaining decade of her life. Curiosity 9. Albert changed everything and cost her control. They married in February 1840. Victoria wore white, a choice that was genuinely radical at the time, when brides across every class typically wore their best dress regardless of color. She started a tradition that the world still follows today without knowing why. But marriage brought new tensions. Victoria was the queen, Albert was her husband, and in Victorian England a husband was, by law and custom, the head of any household. Their early marriage was marked by fierce arguments over exactly where the lines of authority lay. She resisted his involvement in state affairs. He pushed for more. She was proud. He was strategic. They fought with a passion that matched the love underneath it. Over time, Albert won more ground. He reorganized the royal household, brought order to its finances, and became, in effect, her chief advisor. Victoria came to rely on him completely, intellectually, emotionally, physically. Some historians argue she surrendered more authority than she should have. Others argue he was the better administrator and she recognized it. What is not disputed is what happened when he was gone. Curiosity 10. She despised being pregnant. Victoria had 9 children. 9. And she reportedly hated almost every moment of carrying them. She wrote in her letters that pregnancy made her feel like a rabbit or a factory. She described the physical indignities with a candor that was startling for a woman of her era and her position. She did not romanticize motherhood. She did not perform the beatific contentment society demanded of royal mothers. She found pregnancy uncomfortable, undignified, and frightening, because in the 19th century, childbirth was genuinely dangerous. Women died. Infections killed. The risks were real, and the medical support was, by modern standards, almost non-existent. Curiosity 11. She used chloroform during labor and caused a national controversy during the birth of her 8th child, Leopold. In 1853, Victoria was administered chloroform as pain relief. This was radical. At the time, there was significant religious and social resistance to pain relief during childbirth, with many arguing it went against the natural order. By choosing anesthesia, Victoria helped shift that conversation permanently, striking a blow, whether she intended to or not, against centuries of justification for women's suffering. Her endorsement made pain relief acceptable for ordinary women across the country. She likely saved an incalculable number of people from unnecessary agony. Curiosity 12. Her relationship with her children was complicated for someone who disliked pregnancy so intensely. Victoria's relationship with her children was rich with contradiction. She could be warm and playful. She could also be cold, demanding, and sharply critical. She clashed famously with her eldest son, Bertie, the future King Edward VII, whom she found shallow and self-indulgent. She blamed him with unfair but understandable maternal logic for the stress that she believed contributed to Albert's death. She was closest perhaps to her eldest daughter Vicky, who was intellectual, curious, and most resembled Albert. Losing Vicky to cancer in 1901, just months before her own death, was one of the final wounds of her long life. Curiosity 13. The first assassination attempt came when she was pregnant. On the 10th of June 1840, a young man named Edward Oxford fired 2 pistols at the Queen's carriage as she rode through London. She was 4 months pregnant with her first child. Neither shot struck her. She remained visibly composed. The public was horrified. She was celebrated as courageous. And she was courageous. But she was also terrified in ways no newspaper of the time would have printed. 5 more attempts would follow across her reign. Curiosity 14. Someone tried to beat her with a cane. In 1850, a former Army officer named Robert Pate approached the Queen's carriage and struck her with his cane. She was left bruised and visibly shaken, but it was not the physical injury that made this attempt stand out. It was the intimacy of it. Someone had put their weapon directly on the Queen of England in broad daylight, close enough to touch her. Of all 6 attempts, this one felt the most personal. She attended the opera that same evening. Curiosity 15. She was a prisoner of her own. Sex Victoria reigned at a time when the ideology of separate spheres governed almost every aspect of British society. Men belonged to the public world of politics, law, and commerce. Women belonged to the private world of home, children, and moral instruction. A queen regnant, a woman who ruled in her own right rather than through a king, was a living contradiction of everything her society believed about gender, and society made sure she felt it. She was expected to be deferential as a wife while simultaneously being the supreme head of state. She was expected to be nurturing as a mother while signing legislation and managing an empire. Every instinct of her culture told her that power was unfeminine, that ambition was unnatural, that her authority was a legal accident to be managed around, not a rightful inheritance to be exercised. Curiosity 16. Her empire was built on suffering. She rarely saw the British Empire under Victoria expanded to cover roughly a quarter of the globe. It was the largest empire in human history, and it was built, sustained, and enriched by the systematic extraction of resources, labor, and lives from colonized peoples across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. Victoria's personal feelings about empire were complex and sometimes contradictory. She took pride in it. She took an unusual interest in India in particular, learned Hindustani, and appointed an Indian servant, Abdul Karim, as her personal munshi, her teacher and companion in later life, to the deep scandal of her household. But she was also insulated from the daily realities of colonial violence in ways that made her culpability both real and diffuse. She did not personally order the atrocities committed in her name. She was not, in the way of a modern leader, fully accountable in the way we might demand today. History is not so simple. But the suffering was real, and it demands acknowledgement even in a story centered on her. Curiosity 17, the Irish famine, unfolded during her reign, and she was never forgiven. Between 1845 and 1852, 1 million people died of starvation in Ireland. Another million emigrated. The British government's response, shaped by laissez-faire economic ideology and a deeply troubling indifference, was catastrophically inadequate. Victoria donated £2,000 to Irish famine relief, a gesture that some Irish commentators at the time noted was less than she had donated to a dog's home. The story may be apocryphal. The anger is not. The famine scarred the relationship between Ireland and the British Crown for generations, and Victoria's name was part of that wound. Curiosity 18, the hemophilia in her blood. Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia B, a genetic condition that prevents normal blood clotting and can make even minor injuries life-threatening. She passed the gene to at least 3 of her 9 children, and through them, it spread to the royal families of Russia, Spain, and Germany. Her grandson, Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, son of Tsar Nicholas II, was a hemophiliac. His suffering and the desperate attempts to treat him drew the mystic Rasputin into the Russian imperial family. Historians have argued with genuine seriousness that the hemophilia Victoria, unknowingly introduced into the Russian imperial line, was one of the contributing factors to the instability that ended in the Russian Revolution. The grandmother of Europe, the grandmother of catastrophe. Curiosity 19. Albert's death destroyed her. On the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. He was 42 years old. The cause officially was typhoid fever, though some historians have suggested he may have also been suffering from stomach cancer. He had been ill for weeks. Victoria had nursed him herself, sleeping beside him, holding his hand as his condition deteriorated. When he died, something in Victoria died with him. She was 42 years old. She had 40 more years ahead of her, and she would spend almost all of them in mourning. Curiosity 20. She wore black for 40 years. Victoria did not observe a conventional mourning period. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She withdrew from public duties to such an extent that Republican sentiment, genuine, vocal, organized Republican sentiment, emerged in Britain for the first time in over a century. Newspapers asked openly, what use was a queen who refused to be seen? Some called for the abolition of the monarchy itself. She was unmoved, or rather, she was moved so deeply inward that external pressure ceased to reach her. Curiosity 21. She laid out his clothes. Every day, every morning for 40 years, the royal household followed the same ritual. Hot water was brought to Prince Albert's dressing room for a shave he would never take. His clothes were laid out. His towels were arranged. His side of the bed was prepared as though he might return at any moment. Victoria kept a plaster cast of his hand beside her always. She had a copy of his death mask, the impression taken of his face at the moment of death. And she traveled with it. She did not want to forget. She did not want to move on. She did not believe that moving on was the correct response to losing the person who was everything to you. Curiosity 22. John Brown. Into the hollow left by Albert's death stepped John Brown, a Scottish Highland servant who had worked in the royal household. He was blunt, unpolished, and utterly unimpressed by royalty. He called her woman to her face. He refused to coddle her. He pulled her back into the world when she retreated too far from it, insisting she ride, that she take fresh air, that she live, rather than simply endure. The court despised him. The press mocked their relationship viciously, publishing cartoons and insinuations. Some called Victoria Mrs. Brown. Rumors circulated, then and in every generation since, about the true nature of their bond. Whether it was romantic or platonic may be unknowable. What is certain is that he helped keep her alive in some meaningful sense after Albert's death. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria was devastated. She requested that certain items be buried with her, including a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair, placed in her left hand beneath her flowers, so that it would not be easily noticed. Some losses she never stopped carrying. Curiosity 23. Abdul Karim and the household's contempt. In the final years of her life, Victoria formed a close bond with Abdul Karim, an Indian servant who arrived at court in 1887 for her Golden Jubilee and never quite left. She promoted him rapidly, learned Hindustani from him, and accorded him a social status that caused her household to react with a hostility rooted openly in prejudice, contempt for his origins, his religion, and his growing closeness to the Queen. Her children, her courtiers, her doctors, nearly everyone around her, attempted to undermine, humiliate, and ultimately remove Abdul Karim from her favor. Victoria resisted them all with the same stubborn force she had once directed at Conroy and at those who tried to tell her how to grieve. She was in her 70s. She was slowing, but she was still, fundamentally, her own woman. Curiosity 24. Postpartum depression, before anyone had a name for it. After the birth of several of her children, Victoria exhibited behaviors that modern historians and psychologists recognize as consistent with postpartum depression: withdrawal, irritability, emotional numbness, a disconnection from her children in their infancy that she sometimes later regretted. She was not diagnosed. There was no diagnosis available. She was told she was tired or that she was experiencing the normal aftermath of childbirth. No one asked if she was suffering. Queens were not supposed to suffer in ways that could not be managed quietly. Curiosity 25. The weight of the crown was physical as well as symbolic. The imperial state crown weighs approximately 1 kilogram. The crown Victoria wore for the state opening of Parliament, an event she was expected to attend with full ceremonial dignity, including the heavy crown, the royal robes, and the rigid posture demanded by court protocol, caused her genuine physical discomfort throughout her reign. In her later years, she often wore a small diamond coronet instead, to the quiet disapproval of traditionalists. Her body, like her mind, bore the marks of what power demanded. Curiosity 26. She was deeply superstitious. Victoria believed in the supernatural, in spirits, in signs, in the possibility of contact with the dead. In the years after Albert's death, she is said to have attended seances in private. Whether she genuinely believed she contacted him or simply found comfort in the ritual, no one can say with certainty. But the woman who had commanded the most powerful empire on earth also sat in darkened rooms, hoping the veil between life and death might thin enough to let her hear his voice one more time. Curiosity 27. Her reign was defined by a moral code. She did not always embody. The Victorian era gave its name to a set of social values: piety, sexual restraint, domestic virtue, hard work, public decorum, that shaped British culture for decades. Victoria herself was the symbolic embodiment of these values. And yet her private life told a different story. Passionate, physical love for Albert that she described in terms that would have scandalized her public. Deep, possibly romantic bonds with men outside her marriage. Emotional volatility that contradicted the era's ideal of feminine composure. She was not a hypocrite exactly. She was a human being. The image she projected was not false. It was simply incomplete. Curiosity 28. She lived long enough to see it all change. Victoria came to the throne in a world lit by candlelight and driven by horses. She died in a world of electric light, automobiles, and telegraphs. She witnessed the rise of industrial cities, the expansion and the first cracks in her empire, the emergence of modern medicine, the transformation of warfare, the beginning of a world that would become, in the century after her death, almost unrecognizable. She adapted, reluctantly in some areas, enthusiastically in others. She was an early adopter of the telegraph and used it to communicate with far-flung parts of the empire. She was photographed extensively, understanding intuitively that the new technology of the image would shape how she was perceived. She was, for all her attachment to the past, a woman who lived in an age of transformation. Curiosity 29. Her death was as solitary as her birth. Victoria died on the 22nd of January 1901 at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She had been declining for weeks, her eyesight failing, her memory slipping, her body slowly giving way after 63 years of reign. Her final hours were attended by her son Bertie, now King Edward VII, and in a detail that struck many as almost unbearably poignant, by her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who held her body in his arms as she died, cradling the grandmother of Europe as she left it. She was 81 years old. She had been queen for 63 years, a record that stood until 2015, when Elizabeth II surpassed it. Curiosity 30. Her funeral instructions were precise and personal. Victoria left meticulous instructions for her own burial. She was to be dressed in white, not the black of her mourning decades, but white, a return to something before the grief. She was to be buried with Albert's dressing gown laid beside her, with a plaster cast of his hand, with a lock of John Brown's hair in her left hand, covered by flowers, with Brown's mother's ring on her finger. She took her contradictions with her into the ground. Curiosity 31, the grandmother of Europe, left a world she could not have imagined. Victoria's blood runs through the current royal families of the United Kingdom, Sweden, Norway, Spain, and several other European houses. Her descendants fought on both sides of the First World War. Her granddaughter Alexandra became the last Empress of Russia. Her life, and the lives of her children, ending in tragedy in Yekaterinburg in 1918 in one of the most haunting epilogues of the Victorian bloodline. Her great-great-granddaughter is Queen Elizabeth II, whose own record-breaking reign stretched into the 21st century. She did not simply reign. She wove herself into the genetic and political fabric of the modern world in ways that are still unraveling. So next time you see a royal wedding broadcast across the world, the white dress, the flowers, the solemn ceremony, know that those traditions were shaped by a woman who wore white, not because it was traditional, but because she loved a man and wanted the world to see it. Know that the image of royalty you carry in your mind was built, in part, on a fiction that Victoria herself helped construct and privately struggled to believe in. She was not the stern, stiff, black-clad figure of popular mythology. She was a girl who grew up in a prison dressed as a palace, a young woman who discovered the intoxicating terror of absolute power, a wife who loved with a completeness that left her shattered when that love was taken, a mother who found the role more complicated than her era would allow her to admit, a widow who retreated so far into grief that her empire nearly forgot she was still alive. Power did not make her free. The crown did not make her happy. The empire did not fill the silence on Albert's side of the bed. What she left behind was immense, a transformed nation, a reshaped world, a bloodline woven through European history like a thread you cannot pull without unraveling something else. What she carried privately was something smaller, heavier, and far more human: longing, loss, and the bone-deep exhaustion of performing strength for 63 years. She was the most powerful woman of her era. She was also, in the ways that matter most, deeply, recognizably, achingly human. And that perhaps is the most extraordinary thing about her. If this story moved you, if Victoria's life surprised you, or haunted you, or made you see her differently, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment below. What shocked you the most about Queen Victoria? Was it the grief, the assassination attempts, the hemophilia that changed the course of history? I read every comment, and I want to know which part of her story stayed with you. The past is never as simple as the portraits make it look, and the people inside the frames are always more than we expect.